Good evening and welcome to Nashotah House. I'm Garwood Anderson, Dean of Nashotah House, and my job tonight is to introduce our introducer for this evening's lecture and to extend a warm welcome to you to Nashotah House. If you've never been here before, Nashotah House is a seminary in the Anglican tradition that was established in 1842 right on this property to propagate the Christian faith in the Anglican tradition. We've been doing that for 182 years, never changed our mind, never did anything different. Plan to do that for the next couple of centuries also. And we're so delighted that you can be here tonight. We love doing these every now and then, book talks and lectures from prominent Christian speakers. And we're thrilled tonight to have Holly Ordway with us. But she's going to have a proper introduction from Father Travis Bott, who is our professor of Old Testament and Hebrew, and also the chair of our faculty. So, Father Bott, would you come and introduce our speaker, please?
Well, when they say I need no introduction, they mean it literally, because you're not here to hear me, but you're here to hear our speaker tonight, Dr. Holly Ordway. We're delighted to have her and delighted to welcome so many of you, so many old friends and so many new friends with us this evening. She'll be speaking on the topic of Tolkien's faith and the foundations of Middle-earth. Dr. Ordway is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, as well as the Visiting Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. And her books include these, among others: Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Tales of Faith, and tonight's talk relates to her most recent book publication, Tolkien's Faith, A Spiritual Biography. And tonight we're in for a treat. We're in for learning a lot about J.R.R. Tolkien and his Christian faith and the particularities of his faith. But if we're open, we're also in for a challenge to our own faith and an edification of our faith in God. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Holly Ordway.
Well, thank you very much. Good, the mic is working. We're off to a good start. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. The hospitality I've had so far has been lovely. I appreciate that you have a reasonably hobbit-sized podium. This is good. So I plan to speak for about 45 minutes. We'll have a nice solid Q&A that Father Travis will be hosting. And then afterwards, I will be signing books until you're done with me or until I drop or until we sell the books, any combination of those things. So I know some of you got your books signed ahead of time, and that was great. But if you didn't, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, right? So it really is a pleasure to be here and to be speaking to you about Tolkien's faith and the foundations of Middle-earth. September 2nd, 2023 marked the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. And at this point, the contribution that he had made to English literature and culture has been widely recognized. In the UK, the Royal Mint honored him with a special £2 coin, one of the first to be minted with the head of King Charles III, and with Tolkien's monogram on the other side, describing him as writer, poet, and scholar. And just recently, they did a popular vote as to all the first coins that were minted, which was the popular favorite, and this one won, another mark of Tolkien's recognition in the wider culture. And Tolkien's magnum opus, The Lord of the Rings, is a worldwide bestseller. It's been translated into more than 50 languages, from Arabic and Chinese to Thai and Turkish. The film adaptations are loved by millions of people who haven't yet read the books, and for many of them it leads to an enjoyment of the books. And Amazon's The Rings of Power was the most expensive television series ever made, second season now in the works. Yet Tolkien was both a thoroughgoing Englishman and a devout Catholic of a traditionalist mindset. His world of Middle-earth is rooted in English soil, and his religious views are shared by a tiny fraction of his total readership. And so this gives us a paradox that's worth considering. A deeply Christian man has produced an imaginative work that's fantastically popular with readers of all faiths and none. Let's turn now to a quote from one of Tolkien's letters. It's one I'm sure that many of you have seen before, or at least its first line, which is the most often quoted. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put and sounds more self-important than I feel. For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8 in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know. What are we to make of this? One thing we should be clear on from the start, it doesn't mean that Christianity in general, or Catholicism in particular, is some sort of interpretive key that unlocks a secret meaning. No. And indeed, if we take seriously that Tolkien described his work as fundamentally religious and Catholic, we must also take seriously the ways that he qualified and contextualized statements like this one. Tolkien was always emphatic that his writings could not be read as straightforward allegory. As he remarked rather tartly in one letter, "The Lord of the Rings is not about anything but itself. Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political." And this is borne out by the massive popularity of this story, with a global fan base that includes vast numbers of people who do not share his religious beliefs. Whatever The Lord of the Rings is, it's not a simple allegory of the Christian faith or a presentation of the Gospels in the guise of fantasy. But that is not to say that The Lord of the Rings bears no relation to the Christian religion that Tolkien himself actually believed in. His great work is, as he says, of course, fundamentally religious and Catholic. That, of course, is very interesting. It seems natural and obvious to him that it should be so. And that is because, as Tolkien says, it is fundamentally Catholic. That is, at its fundament, in its roots, at its essence. This religious and Catholic element is, he explains, absorbed into the story and the symbolism. It's woven into the warp and the woof of the text, implicit, indirect. It was not consciously planned. Rather, the whole world of Middle-earth and everything in it is rooted in the author's Christian vision of reality. And he says that this rootedness, this unplanned but essential quality of his work, comes about because he has been raised and nourished in the Catholic faith. Tolkien's faith was lifelong and deep. He was a committed Christian, and he was not shy about saying so publicly. He also drew attention to the importance of his faith in his work. In one letter, Tolkien explained that there is a scale of significance in the types of facts that are relevant to understanding an author's works. He places at the bottom of the scale his preference for certain languages, explaining that although this has some relation to his writings, it does not really explain the works. Other facts, he says, are really significant, such as his rural childhood before the age of the machine. But then he goes on to say, more important, I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories. Now we know that his childhood experiences and his linguistic interests were imaginatively formative, but by Tolkien's own reckoning, his faith was more important for understanding his writings than either of these. So if we are to understand and appreciate Tolkien's writings to the fullest degree, we need to look deeply to understand what he himself identified as being fundamental to his identity and to the way he expressed himself in his fiction. The way that we go about this is important. Tolkien's faith was shaped by his personal context and by his deliberate commitments to the spiritual life. He was a Christian, which means certain things in contrast to the generally secular approach of the modern world, both in his day and in ours. More specifically, he was a Catholic, which provided a particular shape and structure for his faith. And not just a Catholic, but one who lived out his faith through the first 3/4 of the 20th century, which featured 2 world wars and major changes in the way that the church understood and expressed itself. Furthermore, Tolkien can only be fully understood if we appreciate that he was not just a 20th century Catholic, but an English Catholic, part of a faith community that had experienced persecution, marginalization, and restrictions on civil rights, some of which continued all the way to Tolkien's adulthood. And lastly, his formation as an English Catholic of the 20th century was greatly shaped by his particular circumstances of his youth and his childhood, his connection with the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, which continued not just through his youth, but through his entire life. And so tonight, I want to trace some instances of the way that his faith was fundamental to the shaping of Middle-earth, looking particularly at the themes of beauty, humor, humility, and suffering. To do that, we need to begin at the beginning. Tolkien was in fact baptized as an infant in the Anglican Cathedral in Bloemfontein, South Africa. But the heat of Bloemfontein was bad for his health, and when he was just 3 years old, his mother Mabel took him and his baby brother Hilary back to England for what they thought would be only a temporary visit. However, they never returned, and Tolkien never saw his father again. The following year, just as Mabel was preparing to bring the boys back to South Africa, his father Arthur died. His widowed mother, Mabel, and her sons stayed in Birmingham. And 4 years later, in 1900, Mabel was received into the Catholic Church. Her family was intensely hostile to this move, cutting off financial supports and pressuring her to recant her Catholicism. And though we might take for granted that, of course, Tolkien remained a Catholic in honor of his mother, it could easily have been otherwise. He might have rejected the faith that led so directly to poverty and stress for his family. After all, his grandparents and his aunts and his uncles would have warmly welcomed him back into the Anglican faith of his dead father. In the strongly anti-Catholic culture of 20th century England, it would in many ways have made his life easier and more comfortable if he had reverted to Anglicanism, or if he'd made his Catholic faith a purely private matter. But he didn't, not as a boy and not later on in his life. But he might have done so And keeping that in mind will help us to understand and appreciate more fully the shape of his faith and what it meant to him. Tolkien was confirmed as a Catholic shortly before his 12th birthday at the Birmingham Oratory. He took the confirmation name of Philip, after St. Philip Neri, the 16th century Italian priest who was the founder of the Oratorians. And he even later wove that name Philip into the famous monogram of his initials, where we can trace John Ronald Reuel Philip Tolkien. After his mother died in 1904, the Birmingham Oratory became of central importance for Tolkien. Father Francis Morgan became his guardian, and many years later, Tolkien recalled that at the Oratory, he had the advantage of a good Catholic home in excelsis, in the highest, virtually a junior inmate of the Oratory house, which contained many learned fathers, largely converts. Now, I need to give a little bit of background on the Birmingham Oratory, because it's not just the name of a church. It's called the Oratory because it's part of the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. The Oratory in Birmingham was the first to be established in England. It was founded by John Henry Newman, who had been one of the leading lights of Oxford. He was Fellow of Oriel College, Oxford, and Vicar of the University Church. After he became a Catholic and was ordained a priest in Rome, Newman returned to England with his friends who had been converted and ordained along with him to establish a religious community, and he chose the Oratory of St. Philip Neri as the most suitable. He founded the Birmingham Oratory in 1852 and was its superior until his death in 1890. One of the reasons that Newman felt that the Oratorian rule was a good fit for himself and his fellow well-educated converts was that it allowed for the retention of personal property such as books, and it encouraged scholarly pursuits among its members. In addition to valuing the intellectual life, Newman explained that the rule sets great store by the arts as a means to draw people closer to God, especially music. Oratories have a special mission to the more highly educated in the community, and they emphasize outreach and evangelism through the beauty of architecture, vestments, and liturgy, especially liturgy in terms of music. And this positive attitude towards the intellectual life and the arts continued to Tolkien's day. The parish magazine of those years, I've looked at them in the Birmingham Oratory, the issues are full of poetry and articles about literature. And here, the young Tolkien, who was interested in art and literature from a very early age in his boyhood, found an environment that encouraged those aspects of his personality and his interests. Now, the Oratorians place special emphasis on music. St. Philip Neri decided that a good way to engage with the young men of his day was to provide musical evenings that were interwoven with scripture readings, lectures, and discussions. And it's because of this interest in music that composers began to create oratorios. That's where we get the name. They originally meant pieces written specifically for St. Philip's Oratory in Rome. The Birmingham Oratorians continued this tradition, and they made new programs for musical evenings under the guidance of Father Robert Eaton. And it's worth considering whether these oratorios that wove together scripture and music might possibly have made some contribution to the inspiration for Tolkien's account in the Silmarillion, the creation of Middle-earth, which is expressed in musical terms. Tolkien was also introduced at the Birmingham Oratory when he was a boy to plain chant or Gregorian chant, which is something that he would probably not have heard as an Anglican at that time. And it made a great impression on Tolkien. His daughter Priscilla later recalled that the only kind of music I knew him to love dearly was Gregorian plain chant. And here we can trace a direct influence on Tolkien's Middle-earth. Soon after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explained that a few of the songs in it are written to specific tunes. One of these, he said, was the elvish chant that Galadriel sings to the Fellowship as they depart from Lothlorien. This, he says, is a lament that has in mind the tones used in the Lamentatio of Tenebrae, the chant of the readings from the Bible's Book of Lamentations during the Tenebrae prayer service of Holy Week. Now, Tolkien's early years were full of loss and sorrow. By the age of 12, he had lost first his father and then his deeply beloved mother. As a teenager, he fell in love, only to have Father Francis forbid him to have any contact with his sweetheart for 3 years until he came of age. And he obeyed, although it was very painful, out of love for his guardian, whom he considered to be his second father. When he did reconnect with Edith, and that's a dramatic story of its own, and we can come back to that in the Q&A if we like. But when he did reconnect with Edith, they married in 1916, shortly before Tolkien was sent to the front lines of the Great War, where he fought in the Battle of the Somme. Tolkien later recalled that all but one of his close friends was killed in the war. He himself contracted a severe case of trench fever, which became chronic and contributed to his serious health problems throughout his life. Now, these experiences would in themselves be more than enough to account for a bleak view of life, and Tolkien did indeed have a depressive streak in his character. But what's surprising is not so much that he had times of intense melancholy, but rather that he also had such a deep-seated streak of joy and fun. His exceptionally complex intellect was balanced by what he himself described rather wryly in later years as a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. And here we can perhaps see an influence from those formative years at the Oratory. Philip, as well as being called the third apostle of Rome, is called the Apostle of Joy. One of Philip's maxims was that his disciples should maintain cheerfulness and preserve themselves from sin. The approach of the Oratorians in nurturing spiritual health through fostering cheerfulness, even or especially in difficult times, would certainly have been of assistance in helping the orphaned young Tolkien to ease back into enjoyment of life. Tolkien, in fact, exhibited a readiness to be silly throughout his entire life. For instance, for his son Christopher's 21st birthday party, he sent invitations that demonstrate his sense of humor. Carriages at midnight, ambulances at 2 a.m., wheelbarrows at 5 a.m., hearses at daybreak. Now, some of the instances of Tolkien's adult sense of humor even kind of verge on the embarrassing or certainly undignified. So, for instance, as an elderly man, on at least one occasion, he disconcerted a shopkeeper by paying with a handful of coins that included his false teeth. Now, I can only imagine that he had sneezed or coughed, and finding his dentures in his hand, he just sort of handed them over with a whole lot. And I have to admit that, when I was initially studying Tolkien years ago, I was a little weirded out by this. I thought, this is undignified. Here he is, a full professor at Oxford, and, now he's in his prime. He's the author of a worldwide bestseller. Surely he ought to live up to his status as a figure of high academic repute and a literary lion. Well, not according to the teachings of St. Philip Neri, who considered spiritual pride to be a serious danger and humility to be the best remedy. Philip remarked, "Let us pray God, if he gives us any virtue or any gift, to keep it hidden even from ourselves, that we may preserve our humility and not take occasion of pride because of it." Philip was himself an exceptionally gifted man, widely considered a saint in his own lifetime. But although he took the spiritual life seriously, he never took himself too seriously. So, for instance, Philip once showed up at a party with half of his beard shaved off. Just half. Now, this had a serious point, though, because he had realized that he had been invited to the party because the rich man who was the host wanted to show off his pet saint. Look at how holy I am that I can get Philip Neri to come to my party. And Philip wanted to undercut that spiritual pride, so he showed up making himself look like a fool. Now, this Philippine teaching on humility that Tolkien absorbed as a young man didn't preclude achievement. It didn't even preclude pride in achievement, but rather it sought to keep the right perspective. Philip warns against pursuing achievements for the sake of worldly praise, but he's also aware of a kind of scrupulosity that could arise. And so he explained, it does not take away our merit in the spiritual life if we enjoy praise and acclaim for our work, as long as it wasn't deliberately sought after for its own sake. If we have done good work, then we are to accept whatever praise or acclaim comes from it, just not dwell on it or treat it like it's important. And this early formation in humor and humility would stand Tolkien in good stead. When first The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings became worldwide sensations, fan mail just came pouring in, often of the most gushing kind. But Tolkien was from the start alert to the spiritual dangers of lavish praise, which he calls incense, as in the incense offered before idols. In 1944, he remarked on a fan letter that he'd received from an American boy who declared that he'd read The Hobbit no fewer than 11 times. Tolkien's comment is telling. I find these letters, which I still occasionally get, apart from the smell of incense which fallen man can never quite fail to savor, make me rather sad. What thousands of grains of good human corn must fall on barren stony ground if such a very small drop of water should be so intoxicating. But I suppose one should be grateful for the grace and fortune that have allowed me to provide even the drop. And in the last year of his life, he commented, being a cult figure in one's own lifetime, I'm afraid, is not at all pleasant. However, I do not find that it tends to puff one up. In my case, at any rate, it makes me feel extremely small and inadequate. But even the nose of a very modest idol cannot remain entirely untickled by the sweet smell of incense. Now we see this element of humor and humility reflected in his personality and also in his most famous creation, the hobbits, people who are merry and full of laughter, fond of cheerful jests at all times. They are, he says, hospitable and delighted in parties. They're also the most humble and simple of all the peoples of Middle-earth. They're not powerful warriors like Aragorn or Boromir. They're not wise like Gandalf or Elrond. And this is not a coincidence. It's in these terms that Tolkien explained one of the fundamental themes of The Lord of the Rings. It is, he wrote, planned to be hobbitocentric. That is, primarily a study of the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble. And he remarked that he saw the value of hobbits in putting earth under the feet of romance and in providing subjects for ennoblement and heroes more praiseworthy than the professionals. I would not be a hero is, of course, as good a start for a hero as I would not be a bishop for a bishop. We are all equal before the great author who puts down the mighty from their seat and exalts humble. And, of course, Tolkien is here quoting from the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise, in which she says, He hath regarded the humility of his handmaid. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their heart. He hath put down the mighty from their seats and hath exalted the humble. And here we can begin to better understand what Tolkien meant when he said that it was upon Our Lady that all my own small perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, is founded. It was evidently entirely natural for his mind to connect the humility of the hobbits with the beautiful humility and simplicity of Mary. Tolkien, in fact, recommended the Magnificat as a prayer to learn by heart. Another prayer that Tolkien found deeply meaningful is the Litany of Loretto, and even translated a portion of it into his Elvish language of Quenya. In the Litany of Loretto, Mary is addressed under various titles. Some of them present her in symbolic terms, such as Mirror of Justice or Mystical Rose. And one of these titles is Consolatrix Afflictorum, which means Comforter of the Afflicted. In 1916, when Tolkien was in the trenches in France, on the front lines of the Great War, he wrote a poem in honor of Mary, which begins with the line, "O Lady Mother enthroned amid the stars." He gave the poem two different titles. One of these was Consolatrix Afflictorum. One of these was Consolatrix Afflictorum. You can see that at the bottom there. And this is one of the Marian titles from the Litany of Loretto. And so given the circumstances, it's not surprising that he chose to reflect on Mary as Comforter of the Afflicted. The other title he gave it was Stella Vespertina, and this is connected to the Litany of Loretto at one remove. It's Tolkien's own invention, and it's a variant of one of the Marian titles in the Litany, that is Stella Matutina, or Morning Star. So whereas Stella Matutina means morning star, Tolkien's variant means evening star. Now, the symbolism of the morning star and the evening star in Christian iconography is extremely rich and complex, and there's several different ways that this ends up making its way into Tolkien's work. But with regard to specifically the Litany of Loretto, because Christ is traditionally associated with the sun, his mother Mary is associated with the morning star. She's the lesser light who heralds the imminent arrival of the greater light. And that's the imagery of her title, Stella Matutina, the morning star. Now, Tolkien was interested in astronomy, and he would have known that both the morning star and the evening star refer to the planet Venus, which appears in the western sky after sunset, as well as in the eastern sky before sunrise. And these celestial appearances would have become just weighted with deep emotional and spiritual significance when he began to serve on the front lines of the Great War. Soldiers were required to stand to at dawn and dusk each day. As historian Paul Fussell has explained, stand to was a solemn moment. Twice a day, everyone stared silently across the wasteland at the enemy's hiding places and considered how to act if a field gray line suddenly appeared and grew larger and larger through the mist and the half-light. This military routine of standing to arms in combat readiness at daybreak and at nightfall were, as Fussell notes, moments of heightened ritual anxiety, all the more wrenching and cruel in contrast to the prevailing imagery of dawn and dusk as moments of peace and tranquility. Tolkien's adaptation of the litany to address Mary as Stella Vespertina, as opposed to Stella Matutina, is thus both astronomically and theologically apt, and all the more so when we consider how he paired it with the other title for his poem, Consolatrix Afflictorum. This image of Mary as the evening star invites us to consider how she is visible when the sun, her sun, has disappeared below the horizon. Christ may have died, but his mother is still present, consoling those who, like her, mourn his loss. And in the nightmarish situation of the trenches, with the problem of evil and suffering clearly apparent, this is an image of faith as experienced, or at least as hoped for, in the darkness. Years later, Tolkien gave to his character Arwen in The Lord of the Rings the name Undomiel, meaning evening star. In calling her the evening star, he was giving her a title that had Marian associations for him, and specifically ones that were rooted in his Great War experiences. And the significance of this title is underscored by the fact that it's twice contrasted with the beauty of full daylight as represented by Galadriel. It seems that this finding of beauty in the night was of tremendous importance for Tolkien. It allowed him to explore, in The Lord of the Rings, images and tales of great darkness, but without losing sight of hope. In his 1916 poem, Tolkien described Mary as enthroned amid the stars, another indication that he sees her as present in the darkness of night, not just in the brightness of day. And we can perhaps see the influence of this celestial image of Mary in the scene where Sam and Frodo, having escaped from the orcs, begin their seemingly helpless trek into Mordor. Sam looks up, and he sees a single star shining in the cloud rack above the mountains. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the Forsaken Land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. So we saw a moment ago that Tolkien quoted from the Gospel of Luke in connecting Mary's Magnificat with the humble hobbits. And that's a reminder that another characteristic of Tolkien's faith was that it was grounded in a lifelong, deep attention to Scripture. Tolkien was an expert philologist, and philology literally means love of words, that is, languages and the study of their history. This love was rooted in a deep knowledge and love of the written word of God. His friend Clyde Kilby, who spent a summer assisting him with the Silmarillion, recalled that in their conversations, every single day he would get onto scriptural things. And Kilby said that Tolkien spoke of his special regard for the book of Luke, and for a specific reason, because that writer included so much about women. Tolkien also had a great appreciation for the sheer literary power of St. John's Gospel. One of his military cadet students during the Second World War recalled that at the beginning of their class, Tolkien handed around some sample passages of medieval English that he had typed out. One of them was an English translation of the first verses of the Gospel according to John. "You see," he said triumphantly, "English was a language that could move easily in abstract concepts when French was still a vulgar Norman patois." Now, not only did Tolkien read the Bible, he also helped to translate it. In 1957, he was invited to participate in a major Bible translation project, the Jerusalem Bible in English, and Tolkien agreed to translate the book of Jonah. Tolkien's translation, begun in 1957, was completed by 1961, which is remarkable on two levels. It was completed, and it was completed so quickly. This is quasi-miraculous for Tolkien. Now, he worked from the French text of the Bible de Jerusalem, but he did learn some basic Hebrew in the process. Now, it's interesting that as a translator, Tolkien made some choices that are slightly unexpected. For one thing, he favored a slightly modernizing approach to the language. In working on the Jerusalem Bible, he offered advice regarding the translation as a whole, as well as contributing his own piece. And one of the questions under consideration was whether the Bible translation as a whole should use the modern pronoun you, or the more archaic forms of thee, thou, and ye. Tolkien personally favored using the older forms, and he was adept in using them, but he was in favor of using the you for the Bible translation. Jones, the general editor, thanked him for his support for the you policy. Without it, I should have been most uneasy, having no support, no great confidence in my own decisions. Like you, I regret the passing of thou, etc. Now, it's interesting to note that Jones, as the general editor, was on the fence about whether to use the modern or the archaic form. Tolkien, as the most respected literary figure amongst the translators, someone whom Jones had sought out to do this translation, Tolkien probably could have convinced him to shift over to the archaic form if he had made a case for it. But he believed that it was more appropriate for the modern audience and their needs to use the more modern form of you. Now, Tolkien's translation has some striking passages, such as in his rendering of Jonah's prayer to God from the belly of the fish. The waters were all about me, even to my throat. The abyss encompassed me. The seaweed was wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the countries beneath the earth, unto the peoples of the past. Now, intriguingly, the phrase, the roots of the mountains, appears in The Hobbit, where we are told that Gollum dwells down at the very roots of the mountains. Tolkien used the phrase again repeatedly in Lord of the Rings to refer to the location of Gollum's home. It's an unusual choice of words. We'd usually speak of the foot of a mountain, not its roots. But it's one that Tolkien had encountered long before in a novel by one of his favorite authors, William Morris. The very title of that book was The Roots of the Mountains. Tolkien assimilated this term, like other Morrisian vocabulary terms and stylistic features, into his Middle-earth writings. And so, when it came time to translate Jonah for the Jerusalem Bible, Tolkien didn't choose the Dawei phrasing, which is the lowest parts of the mountains, and he didn't choose the direct translation of the French, à la racine des montagnes, at the root singular of the mountains. He used the plural roots. And so now we can trace a link between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and Jonah. Now, Tolkien approached the text of Jonah in much the same way that he would have done any other literary work for translation. But he retained his basic orientation to the text as inspired and authoritative, something that had direct relevance to him as a Christian. He wrote to his grandson, Michael George, after finishing his initial draft, that the whale, it's not really said to be a whale, but a big fish, is quite unimportant. The real point is that God is much more merciful than prophets, is easily moved by penitence, and won't be dictated to even by high ecclesiastics whom he has himself appointed. And here we can see a theme which resonated through Tolkien's whole life and had a prime place in his magnum opus. For Tolkien, mercy and pity are not merely superficial qualities, but should be part of one's inmost being, a belief that forms a core theme of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien would have well known that pity, meaning sympathetic concern for someone who's suffering, has deep roots in Old English, in which it meant even more fundamentally a disposition toward mercy and compassion. When Frodo exclaims about Gollum, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance," Gandalf turns this thoughtless use of pity, meaning merely too bad, into a profound reminder of the workings of providence. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. Tolkien was a man who endured much sorrow, and he recognized that there are some wounds that cannot be healed in this life. One of the most moving lines I find in Lord of the Rings is at the very end, where Frodo explains that although the Shire has been restored, although everything seems like it's back to normal, he has in fact been wounded too deeply. He must go on to the Grey Havens now. He can't live out his life in the restored Shire the way that he had hoped. He says, "I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. But not for me." Many of Tolkien's contemporaries abandoned their faith in the darkness of the Great War. He didn't. He persevered. It wasn't easy, though. After the war, he went through a barren stretch. There was a long stretch, years in fact, in which, as he recalled, I almost ceased to practice my religion. His faith was ultimately renewed and made stronger, but it was hard-won. And this hard-won faith meant that he could make a convincing picture of beauty being more lasting than sorrow. That despite all the suffering that we may endure in our lives, there is a happy ending, not just in stories, but in reality. In his great essay on fairy stories, Tolkien says this about the happy ending of a fairy story. "It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief." Beauty, humor, humility, suffering, hope, pity, mercy, these were all woven together in Tolkien's spirituality. And I believe that these aspects of his faith form part of the foundations of Middle-earth, in which deep soil all the stories of his legendarium are rooted. Thank you.
We have some time for question and answer. And if you have a question for Dr. Ordway, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
Excellent. I hope we have lots of good questions, or even bad questions. Bad questions will do. Or mediocre questions also acceptable? We won't be judgmental.
Thank you, by the way. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing with us. In understanding Tolkien's work as a Catholic work and not trying to stretch that too far, is it still appropriate to think about images, Catholic images in the story as appropriate to discuss and to kind of, like one example that comes to mind would be Gandalf striking the rock of the doors of Durin and then not being able to come into Lothlorien and dying on the way, kind of like Moses. And just, are those kinds of readings appropriate, and where are kind of the walls on where we should stop with those in order to be faithful to what he would want for the work?
This is a great question. Also a complicated one. I will attempt to not give you an entire other lecture in response to this. Tolkien was very clear that his works are not allegorical. We need to start there. So we don't have a kind of one-to-one correspondence between what we have in the story and his Christian faith or with Scripture. So that clearing that out of the way. Within that, though, we definitely do have, first of all, imagery that he's using that is drawing from Scripture, from his Christian imagination, from his devotional life. We have images that arise. So a classic example of this would be the lembas, the waybread, which has very strong Eucharistic resonances that Tolkien even comments upon in one of his letters. But that doesn't mean that the lembas is the Eucharist in the story, because the context, it's not a liturgical context. It's a different sort of context. but it does give us sort of a resonance as to what the Eucharist is for us as spiritual food, and we see that in the way that the way bread is the nourishment that even increases, power increases as they rely solely upon it. So we have these resonances. We also have what Tolkien calls applicability, which he says resides in the freedom of the reader. So we are free to make connections as they resonate with us. Okay, that said, when we come to specific images, like the one that you've suggested, we have to ask ourselves, does this resonate with the story? Is this giving us additional insight in the story? How likely is it that this is something that Tolkien is either drawing from imaginatively at an unconscious level, because much of what he's doing is drawing unconsciously, and then he later recognizes it consciously. How much of it might be projection? To be perfectly honest, the particular instance that you gave about Gandalf as Moses, I would say not a chance. I think that's a real stretch. That to me is going too far and trying to, because Moses, as a Moses figure, what relevance does that have for Gandalf? It doesn't really resonate. It doesn't fit with the rest of Gandalf's role. It's kind of out of nowhere. Can you make certain points of comparison? Yeah. Do they really work integrally with the story? I would say no. But in contrast, if you look at the scene of Gandalf, the post-resurrected Gandalf meeting Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas in Fangorn Forest, it has a remarkable resonance with the meeting of Jesus with the disciples at Emmaus, because they meet him and at first they don't recognize him. And only after they've had the dialogue about what's been going on, then they have the moment of seeing this is who he is. And that, I think it's quite striking. And that, I think, resonates better with the story. But even that is, Gandalf is sort of occasionally a Christ image, but it's not an allegory. He's not a Christ figure throughout the whole thing. But because of his resurrection moment in Moria, it fits with the story that he takes on certain images of the resurrected Christ. It's resonating with the resurrection theme in the same way that Frodo and Sam resonate with Christ as the suffering servant, on the trek to Mordor, and Aragorn is Christ the healer and Christ the king. So I think we have to kind of be a bit light, hold to things lightly and sort of look for where there's resonances and ask ourselves, are we projecting them on, or are we letting them emerge out? And it's complex, it's difficult, but I think if we err on the side of having a lighter touch, we're more likely to sort of see what he's doing. Sorry, long answer, but it was a great question. No pressure, everybody. The other question can be much worse. They can be much worse. It's okay.
Along those lines, I think of the Feast of the King after the downfall of Mordor, and when Sam jumps up and says, "Great glory and trumpets, have all my dreams come true?" And I think that we're going to live that, right? But just a comment, I didn't make this up, but I love the term and I applied it to myself as a grade schooler and a middle schooler, and then as a young adult, just obsessively cycling through. It catechized my imagination. And I think that's just such a great term for all of these little references. His catechized life, you're right, was transmitted to me.
And I think that's really neat to hear, because Tolkien, it's so interesting. It's so interesting to write a whole book about it. Wait, I did. Go figure. Because on the one hand, he is really, really trying to make sure that people don't read his work wrong, that they don't read it as a very simplistic allegory. And he's so emphatic about that it can sometimes cause people to miss all the other things he says. And one thing he says is that he intended The Lord of the Rings to be an exemplary legend, an example, like you should be able to live this story. And he wanted it to be a way for people to see virtue in real life. So he did, in fact, want it to catechize people's imagination. He just wanted to do it on the implicit level, where it's happening at the the understory, right? Yeah, great questions. Yeah, another one.
I should preface this by saying I'm an aspiring fantasy author myself, so I have read through Tolkien, am incredibly inspired by him, and have been since I was a child, him and Lewis. My question, I guess, is, and it's a loaded one, but how did Tolkien blend this background here with his experience with more secular texts, such as the Prose Edda, the Kalevala, and even more contemporary texts that he was reading at the time that were much more fantastical, mythological, and how did he marry those and then still be able to show his faith through the marriage of these kinds of concepts that he shows through his work?
Great question. I think the answer to that is that he did not write what he wrote to show his faith. He wrote to tell a good story. His faith comes through because he himself was an absolutely committed Christian. And I think that range of priorities is what matters. So he's not instrumentally thinking, how can I present, what can I pick and choose to present the Christian faith? Rather, he's assimilated masses of material and sort of imaginatively digested them. And from that, he is telling the stories that he wants to tell. And he's telling the stories because they're good stories, because they're exciting, because they say something he wants to say. And also, he wants to say true things with it. But that's coming out of his character. It's coming out of who he is. And so that's one of the things I say to aspire. I do a lot of teaching of writing. If I say to Christian students, you want to be a great writer, cultivate personal holiness. That's the first thing. And then work on your art to be a master of your art. Don't instrumentalize your faith. Don't say I'm going to write this thing to share the faith. That usually ends up yielding rubbish, to be perfectly honest. You know what I'm talking about. And Lewis is the same way. Lewis is also doing it the right way. I mean, Lewis more explicitly, but again, coming from that deep faith and absolute mastery of language and tremendous. I mean, Lewis read everything. That sort of integration. So that's how he does it. And I've written another book. So my other Tolkien book is called Tolkien's Modern Reading, and that might interest you because that's where I look specifically at the way that he did assimilate and digest the specifically modern side of things, and I look at how does that work in his creative processes. And it's very complex, and it works in different ways because you have influences in terms of things he's imitating. You have influences in terms of things he is reacting against, saying, I don't like that, I want to do it differently. There's a difference between source material and influences. There's lots going on at all sorts of different levels. And it's a fascinating topic, his creative imagination. So you might be interested in that as well. Good. Maybe from, I don't know, this side of the room and then maybe over there.
I don't mean to privilege this side, but we want to avoid feedback. So I welcome people from the other side to come over to my side.
Thank you. I was particularly fascinated by your discussion of the Stella Vespertina, which I'm learning about here for the first time. Only a few years before, he had encountered another term for the evening star, which was going to be proved influential, and that is Erendel. But that was in a repurposed pagan word, repurposed for a Christian purpose. But yet then when we come a few years later to the First World War, and he is now reimagining Mary as the evening star, it's only then that Erendel ceases to be just a wandering adventurer and takes on this penitential mission. I'm wondering if there's any connection between his encountering the term Erendel his experience in the trenches with reimagining Mary as Stella Vespertina and the mythology that comes out of it later?
I don't know. As I alluded to, even I mentioned it, I had that sentence about it's very complex. That's what I was referring to. That whole imagery of Arundel as the evening star, it's a whole nother layer of complexity, and it kind of interlocks with this imagery of Mary. I do not know where those lines intersect and how they interact with each other. I don't know. Maybe this side also, if you just speak loudly, I'll restate the question so everybody can hear. I feel like you guys are being sort of left out. My heart is sort of bleeding for you. So this question, and then we will. Brilliant. Okay, but I'll restate the question so it can be recorded. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. An evening with Tolkien and an expert on Tolkien is an evening well spent. Thank you very much. So I'm trying to form the questions. Forgive me if it's too convoluted, but clearly Tolkien wasn't a pacifist. But I would suggest that the Lord of the Rings especially can be read as a narrative, but very strict Christian interpretation of just war. And it comes out in lots of places, like the mercy towards Gollum, the mercy at the end towards Saruman, Faramir saying, I wouldn't even lie to an orc. So there's a real sense that virtue is more important than victory, which I don't think most of us embrace anymore. Not in literal warfare, the violence of our culture, but even in culture war, there seems to be, I'm willing to do anything to beat the other side. So would you reflect on that a bit?
Yeah, alas, all too true, everything you've said. And it's a hard thing, right? To want virtue more than victory. That is a very hard thing. And Tolkien was a really remarkable man. He wasn't, you're quite right, he was not a pacifist. He didn't, and it's really interesting because he did not want to fight in the First World War. He was not a gung-ho, sign me up guy. He resisted enlisting until he could get his degree, which would cause him considerable pressure. It was a very, very hard thing to be a young man not in the military in, say, 1915. That was the era of the white feather. So he got a lot of flack for that. But he went in, he fought. In the Second World War, he actually regretted he regretted that he was too old to fight, because he really, really opposed Hitler. And I think it's such to his credit. And Lewis also, his friend Lewis, also saw early on, that Hitler was a monster. Tolkien calls out Nazism and its whole racial agenda as evil. He's straight up about it. He declares that Hitler is under a demonic influence, and he was not, I think, speaking metaphorically. He believed in the spiritual world. And he said he has a burning private grudge against Hitler for perverting and ruining the Northern mythology. And Hitler did, alas, pervert and ruin the Northern mythology, because to this day, the study of the Germanic myths is tainted now with Nazism and Aryanism and all that. I will not say the words I was going to say, because we're being recorded for a family audience. But Tolkien sees that, and he calls it out. But at the same time, he also expresses pity for the German people, who he says are under the curse of this demonic leadership. And he recognizes that they have virtues. Sometimes he has more virtues in some ways than the English. So he's able simultaneously to say, this is a just war. We must fight Hitler. And yet, the German people are also victims here. And what a deep sort of moral understanding that is. We could learn a lot from him, I think.
I'm taking a mediating position here so that this side can ask questions.
Good, yes, good. Yes, here.
You said that you could be convinced to talk about his wife.
Oh, yes. Right, did you have a particular question with that regard?
I'm asking you.
Right. Well, you got a whole nother lecture here. Well, it's a great love story, right? And I don't know if any of you have seen that dreadful biopic, Tolkien. If you haven't, don't. Lame. They mangle the story of Edith. So the cool thing is, so she was also an orphan, Protestant, but with a sort of vaguely Catholic background. So she was, Catholic friendly. They fell in love as teenagers, and all could have been well, except that they started seeing each other and lying about it. And Father Francis wasn't having any of that, and I think very rightly, because we have to remember, because now in hindsight, he ended up marrying Edith. They're married for 50 years until her death. It's a great love story. But think of Father Francis looking after his teenage ward, and he's running off with some girl. Nothing is happening, but he's lying about it. He's saying, I'm going to go here, and instead he's going there with Edith. And lying is a serious sin. So he's like, no, this is not okay. And he says, you can't see each other. And then they keep seeing each other. Right? Okay, we really have to separate you. And part of the problem during this time is that Tolkien's supposed to be studying for a scholarship exam for Oxford. And he's kind of not. And he fails the first time he takes the scholarship exam. I mean, partly he admits later that it's partly Edith, but it's also because he's like learning Finnish for fun, as one does. Sorry, Gothic. It was Gothic he was learning for fun at the time. But the point is that, and here I think Father Francis was just being a very good father to him, because Tolkien had no money. His family, he had no money. He couldn't afford to go to Oxford. This is not an era in which there are lots of scholarships. So he has to get the Oxford scholarship. There's not a lot of money floating around. Father Francis is already paying for a lot of the Tolkien boys' expenses out of pocket, and continued to do so his whole life, actually. I've seen his checkbooks in the Birmingham Oratory. He was very generous towards the Tolkien boys, to both of them. But even he didn't have unlimited funds. Tolkien has to get this scholarship if he's going to go to Oxford. And think of it, we now know that Tolkien is a genius, he'll be a philologist and a brilliant guy. What Father Francis saw was a teenage boy who learns Gothic for fun. So it could have been another person, another guardian, might have just said, I'm just going to get you a clerkship in a bank and keep you out of trouble. You'll be able to make a living, and that's fine. But he knew that Tolkien's gift was academic, that he had this gift. Oxford was the only place that he could really fulfill that. And notice he could have sent him to, say, Dublin, for the Catholic University there. That kind of a second-rate school. He had to go to Oxford. He had to get the scholarship. He can't be running around with this girl getting distracted, right? So there's all these reasons why Father Francis really wants him to buckle down. And so he separates them, and he says to Tolkien, look, you cannot have contact with her until you come of age, until you're 21. And Tolkien obeys. He says it was very hard and painful, but he obeyed. And here's the amazing thing. He didn't just obey when he was still living directly under Father Francis' eye. He gets his scholarship, barely. He goes to Oxford. When he's at Exeter College, Oxford, he could have written to Edith, and Father Francis would never have known. But Tolkien says, I did not want to disobey my guardian. He loved him, and he owed him obedience. So he does not have any contact with Edith until he turns 21. Clock strikes midnight. He writes a letter to Edith, renewing his love and saying, when can we be married? He sends it off to Edith, and he gets a note back that says, I'm actually engaged to another guy. Oops. Tolkien, nothing daunted, telegraphs back, can I see you? Okay. He shoots out there and sees her, and they go for a walk, and by the time they get in for their walk, he's convinced her to break off her engagement and marry him instead. Now, it turns out that Edith, quite understandably, it's been 3 years, she has also kept up her end of the bargain. She has respected that. Does John Ronald still care for me? She's 4 years older than Tolkien, so she's thinking about her future. If she wants to have children, she can't delay marriage forever. And Tolkien recognizes later and says to one of his sons that he asked a lot of Edith, and making her wait in that sense. So she had gotten engaged to just sort of a nice chap, friend of one of her school friends, because he was a decent man. She could see herself being married to him. But Tolkien comes bursting back into her life, and she says, all right. And so they get engaged. Now, here's an interesting thing. Many people think that Edith became Catholic in order to marry Tolkien. She did become Catholic, but she didn't have to. One of the things I learned in researching Tolkien's faith was that mixed marriages, as they were called then, were very common at that time, and it was pretty straightforward. Given the cultural situation of English Catholics, such a minority in the Anglican situation, it was something that happened a lot. And in fact, Father Francis was the child of one of those marriages. His father was an English Protestant, his mother was a Spanish Catholic. So if Edith had not wanted or been willing to become a Catholic, they could have gotten married anyway. So Tolkien wanted her to become a Catholic because he believed this was the true church. He wants his bride to come in with him. But she didn't have to, but she chose to. And I think that's an important thing to note, that it wasn't like, oh, I had to do this to marry Tolkien. I think Tolkien was a bit pressury. I think I think he realized later that he had, he was young and zealous and in love, and so he's kind of a little bit too pushy about it. But Edith was, she was pretty tough too. So I think it's just interesting. There's a lot of nuance in that relationship. They did get married. They had at times a very rough time of it, especially with regard to his faith, because she went through a long stretch in which she was like, I'm not having any of this. Her faith later was renewed, and they carried on. But the important thing is that they truly loved each other, and they stuck with it. It's a real testament to marriage. And Tolkien, in writing a marvelous letter of advice to one of his sons, says, as he put it, he says, you're always going to find, at some point that you find somebody else that you think, oh, if I had married that person. He says your real soulmate is the one you're actually married to. And he says that women are not stars he put on a pedestal. They're companions in shipwreck. Because they're both shipwrecked sinners trying to help each other, right? Companions in shipwreck. So that's, in a nutshell, the story of Edith. There's quite a bit of it in Tolkien's faith. You got the little nutshell version. Right, other question from this side. You're getting your due.
Could you comment on spiritual conversations between Lewis and Tolkien in general, and maybe specifically about apologetics?
Well, there's a lot there. There's actually 2 chapters on Lewis and Tolkien's faith, because there's so much going on there. So briefly, when Lewis and Tolkien met, Lewis was still an atheist. I mean, he had been a Christian, had fallen away from the faith totally, was an atheist when they met. And so their friendship began on the basis of just shared interests. And then they had various conversations. Lewis moves to theism. And then, of course, there's the famous Addison's Walk conversation where there's that breakthrough where he's talking with Dyson and Tolkien, and he has that realization about the fact that the Christian story can be responded to as a story and a story that actually happened. So I think the most notable approach to take, the most notable thing, if you look at what Tolkien says in his poem Mythopoeia, this poem is very little known because it's usually, there's a stanza quoted in his essay on fairy stories, but the poem itself is quite a lot longer. And you can get it in the collection called Tree and Leaf, which is only published in the UK, but you can buy it from Blackwell's and it ships to the US. I recommend it. Little book, it's got the poem in it, Mythopoeia. And this poem it was written shortly after the Addison's Walk conversation. And it's an amazing poem because it's basically an apologetics argument in verse, written specifically for the Lewis who is sort of on the brink of becoming a Christian. And if you know the date, and you think, wow, there's a lot in there that turns up like, in sort of Lewis's apologetics. So we think we have a big influence of Tolkien on Lewis, although that's not really often recognized.
What role did communion play in Tolkien's faith?
Oh, Golly. The Eucharist was really the center point of his faith. He called it, I said, the Blessed Sacrament is the one thing to love on earth. Because as a Catholic, he believed that this is the real presence of our Lord, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the sacrament. And he always felt a real draw towards the Blessed Sacrament and a great reverence for it. And interesting, even when he had that ebb in his faith, that dry stretch where he says, I almost ceased to practice my religion, he speaks also that during that same time, he felt the call of Christ from the tabernacle, but didn't feel that he was living up to this love. So he always felt that love. He said, I fell in love with the Blessed Sacrament early, and by the grace of God, never fell out of it. And that became a sustaining element through his whole life. And I think a big part of that, a really central part of that in terms of spirituality, was the objectivity of it. That, as he writes to, he writes to one of his sons, that the important thing is that that's Christ. It isn't about how we feel at any given moment. It's about God's presence and the graces that you objectively receive from the sacrament. And he gives his son Michael was going through a slump in his own faith, and a marvelous pastoral letter. But one of the things he says to him, kind of counterintuitively, is he recommends as a cure for sagging faith to go to a really poorly done mass. Now, Tolkien had a very high reverence for beauty, reverence, and all that. But he says to his son, go to a mass with like a gabbling, vulgar priest, one where the congregation is like bored and inattentive and badly dressed. And by badly dressed he means disrespectfully, not showing up with any awareness of why we're here. And he says all too common that these things turn up. By the way, he's speaking of the pre-Vatican II church, lest we make any assumptions about that. He's speaking about the traditional Latin Mass. He says, go to one of those where everything is offending your sense of taste and pray for everyone and with them. What an act of humility. And it's an emphasis that by going to a mass that deliberately affronts his taste, it's going to force him to recognize, why am I here? Because of the Eucharist. That's why we're here. Now, obviously, it's better if it's well done, if it's done with reverence. Tolkien would not argue with that. But the point of the exercise is to call your attention back to, why am I here? Who is here? And that is our Lord in the sacrament.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Holly Ordway for a wonderful talk.